The editor of the New York Times said that on a quiet news day, there was no better story than a good story about a fireman or a bad story about a cop. And that was in 1876. I'm just going to take the last question to start with. I just do not know how we are going to get the good news out. I'm making a programme at the moment for Newsnight, which is broadcast this Thursday, I should just mention it in passing. And part of it features the Barton Estate up the road here. On all of our last journey up there to the crematorium, we'll pass through the Barton Estate. In the 1990s, the Barton Estate was a nightmare of crime. The community team up there, now that the main complaints from the residents are dog fouling, littering, and children playing football in the street. It's been turned round by a combination of the public and the police, but there's no story, and I just do not know what you do with that. I think the interesting, I'll go about the first question if I can, about I'm in favour of restorative justice. I think it works a lot of the time, sometimes doesn't work, so it's not, as always, nothing ever is a panacea. But the thing that's missing out of the whole police structure is the equivalent of a King's Fund. There is no place in which a discussion can take place, no representatives, no National Users Council of Policing. So if I can just give you my tiny example, when Jean-Charles de Menezes was shot, there was a great deal of controversy over the thought that this was what was called Operation Kratos, which was a specific set of instructions on how to deal with suicide bombers. It wasn't. But had it been, but the point is, the police had developed such a set of tactics, and the only people who knew about it were the police and one or two Home Office officials, and that was it. And somehow, you know, there is so much work done on the ethics of medicine and the ending of life and the beginning of life, but the police are in the same place in some parts of the ending of life, and there's nowhere to hold that debate, and I find that very depressing.
I'd also like to start with the last question, because I think that's the crucial thing. I think the problems with all of it are to do with the politicisation of law and order that you talked about. And the politicisation of law and order actually confronts politicians with a hiding to nothing, because there's relatively little chance of success within the lifetime of one parliament through pursuing the different solutions. They've got to get out in their own self-interest, I think, from this kind of arms race that has developed about law and order. I think actually only the Conservatives can do that. It's like Nixon going to China. Labour latched onto the law and order bandwagon, tough on crime, tough on causes of crime, because they'd suffered throughout the 80s by being tagged as soft on crime. And they always had that danger for obvious historical reasons. So I think it's the Conservatives who run much less risk of ever being tainted as soft on crime, and could perhaps somehow, in enlightened self-interest, move out of this arms race. Restorative justice, I think, is great, agreed, it doesn't always work. But the problem is that any criminal justice intervention, for example restorative justice, may have a great effect on rehabilitating offenders, on reducing the offences by some people, but they're going to have minimal impact on overall levels of crime for a very simple reason, which is that only about 3% of crimes recorded in the British Crime Survey ever result in an identified offender. And there are lots of crimes that aren't reported in the British Crime Survey, for example murder, for obvious reasons. The British Crime Survey is a victim survey, and it's very hard to interview murder victims. So,
but there aren't many of them.
Yeah, so okay, but there's plenty of drug offences are not in the British Crime Survey, and there's plenty of those. So the British Crime Survey is a huge underestimate of the amount of crime, but even then only 3% result in an offender. So even the best policies for rehabilitating offenders can have only a relatively low impact on the overall levels of crime. Then to go to the first thing, the police powers, I think there's been dramatic changes, I agree. Until the Royal Commission on Police, which you mentioned, in 1962, the official mantra for 150 years was that the police were citizens in uniform, and what that meant was that they had no special police powers other than the ordinary citizen. It was never fully true, but it was largely true. Since then, police powers grew. But the philosophy that underlay that was the philosophy of the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, which was the largest statutory extension of police powers in 1984. And that was that the powers should increase because the police need special powers, but they have to be balanced by adequate safeguards for citizens. So the idea of a balance held sway for about 20 years. But in the last 10 years, even that's been abandoned. The Police and Criminal Evidence Act has been twice subject to hostile internal review in the Home Office. A lot of the safeguards have been watered down, and there's been a proliferation of powers under the terrorism legislation without any corresponding safeguards. Of course, terrorism is a special emergency, but the problem with this is that the powers are generally used not against even suspected terrorists, but once they're in place, they're used much more broadly against people who have no remote suspicion of terrorism about them. So there is an alarming trajectory there. How can we get out of it? Only by addressing the first issue, I think, which is the depoliticisation of law and order.
Yeah, that's very good, and I agree with the whole account of the politicisation is very interesting because it was bipartisan really until about 79 when Thatcher and the police union used to vote and represented by MP by the opposite, by an opposition MP until Elton Griffiths, I think, stayed as a Tory. That's what it started to happen. But what I was saying earlier about this political, this parallel idea of what real policing is and the mythical policing, if you like, is part of the political problem. Because actually, for example, under the Tories in the 80s, the prison population fell. The 1991 Criminal Justice Bill and then the Act was probably the most liberal piece of legislation under the Tories. David Waddington was persuaded simply by the logic of evidence to support this very important piece of legislation, but they backed off as soon as there was a brouhaha. There was some minor stuff about the ratio of fines, the top fine to the lowest fine in terms of your income. I mean, that wasn't well handled. But suddenly the chance to develop this conversation further was lost. And the noise that drowns out is an intelligent conversation about this is terribly sad, because a lot of the work that is done by even the Labour government, while passing something like 4,000 new offences and 1,500 pages of legislation, which has to be processed at sort of half a day of training per something. I mean, it's a terrifying prospect. It's like the Sorcerer's Apprentice, in terms of just creating paper and offences and more criminal justice acts in the last 10 years than in the previous 20 or 30.
And having described by one speaker as a necessary evil and as a class member of the Sorcerer's Apprentice.
Well, this is out of sympathy here. I'm not criticising you for that. It's your namesake, I think, that has a lot to answer.
That's George Orwell.
But just on the restorative justice point, which I've written a book about, called Why Restorative Justice. It's very short, and you might all enjoy it. James Valley uses it for training. That the point about it, the good part about it, is that it does what the Cree, the North American Indian tribe, the Cree, call. They say that the job of the justice system is to close the circle broken by crime, and so that all the people involved in RJ that I've seen and to know about, that includes the victim's family, not just the victim and the offenders and their family, feel that they participated in the resolution if possible. Now, you have to plead guilty, it's voluntary, it's not a magic bullet, but the resonance beyond the immediate experience is very often a good one, a palliative one in the best sense of the word, whereas the justice process and punishment very often leads somebody, usually the person who's gone down, their family or else, to feel that very hard done by, take it out on the witnesses, punish the whole, the feeling of satisfaction is relatively rare compared to the overall satisfaction of people who've been offered RJ, not just took part in it. The level of satisfaction with the justice system, it goes up dramatically on all parts.